Hello, everyone. We are Interaxon from UCLA, and we're here today to teach you about the addiction cycle. So before we start, we want to ask you a couple of questions. Feel free to take some notes to gather your thoughts. So our first question is, what is an addiction? What are some examples of addiction? Have you heard about the cycle of addiction before? So just write down what you know so far. Maybe your teacher can pause the video to allow you time to write down your responses. So now that you've written down what you already know, let's see what's new to you. So addiction is a brain disorder characterized by compulsive engagement in rewarding stimuli despite adverse consequences. So basically, adverse consequences meaning negative consequences. So people who have an addiction engage in this type of behavior, even though they have the possibility of facing some consequences. And this is because of liking, wanting habits. Liking meaning you enjoy it, but you do not seek it. And wanting is you enjoy it and you seek it. While a habit is you don't enjoy it, but you seek it, an automatic behavior. So these types of behaviors are what drive addiction. And remember, addiction is a brain disorder that is characterized by this compulsive engagement. So we see here that two cortical areas or systems moderate this behavior. The goal-directed or goal-oriented / wanting is found in the prefrontal cortex. And then the habitual behavior is found in the sensory motor cortex. In many diseases like addiction, the habitual system takes over. So we see that different parts of our brain are responsible for this type of behavior. And when addiction is brought in, that's the types of areas that are activated. And to go back to our previous discussion of the addiction versus addiction cycle, so the addiction cycle is created by changes produced in brain chemistry from substance abuse and perpetuated by physiological, psychological, and emotional dependency, and so continues until some kind of intervention. So the addiction cycle is just going through these liking, wanting habits over and over again, and it's perpetuated by the physiological, psychological, and emotional dependency. We'll discuss intervention later on in the presentation. So it's important to understand the difference between addiction abuse versus dependence. We're going to compare these two. So abuse is a pattern use of a drug in which the user consumes the substance in amounts or with methods which are harmful to themselves or others. This includes failure to fulfill work, social, school obligations, continuous usage in risky situations, continued use despite social and personal issues, and it's important to note that it never fits the criteria for dependence. And dependence is an adaptive state that develops from repeated drug administration and which results in withdrawal upon cessation of drug use. Cessation meaning stop. So once they cease using or stop using the drug use, withdrawal can recur. So withdrawal symptoms are shakiness or trembling, insomnia, nausea, and vomiting. I'll let you guys take a moment to write these down because it is important to understand the difference between abuse and dependence. Now, there is a physiological nature of addiction. We see here a little hint of what we're going to talk about. So the physiological nature of addiction includes the continued usage of an addictive substance that can lead to positive reinforcement towards the substance. So during this process, the brain actually undergoes physical changes. For instance, continuous usage of an addictive substance leads to the enhancement of the activation of dopamine pathways. From this, the need to use grows stronger and stronger. You might be familiar with the term tolerance. So addiction is physiological as well as psychological. So dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter of the reward system in the brain. Nearly all addictive drugs directly or indirectly act upon the brain's reward system by heightening dopaminergic activity, a mouthful. So the role of dopamine, think of it as a feel-good neurotransmitter. We see here a graphic that helps us better understand the dopamine pathway. Again, dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter of the reward system in the brain, and it plays a role in regulating movement, emotion, cognition, motivation, and feelings of pleasure. Natural rewards that we have, such as eating, recreational drug use, can cause dopamine release and are associated with the reinforcing nature of these stimuli. Nearly all addictive drugs, directly or indirectly, act upon the brain's reward system by heightening dopaminergic activity. Now, we're going to do an activity that involves M&Ms. This will teach us a little bit more of the dopamine pathway and how the dopamine release associates itself with drug abuse and drug addiction. So we're going to have you guys, have your teachers give you a set amount of M&Ms. So in the beginning, we're going to give you, starting out, 5 to 6 M&Ms, about a handful. So this represents the first experience or the first exposure to the drug. Next, you guys are going to pretend that the teacher is going to take the drug for the next time. This time, however, we're going to give you a little bit less of the M&Ms. So you're going to get another batch of M&Ms, but just a little bit less. This represents the decrease in dopamine as the brain gets used to the particular drug. This causes you, the student or the user, to want more and more of the drug in order to feel the same euphoric experience. So take note of when the M&Ms were given to you and the next time you received only a little bit of M&Ms compared to when you were first given the 5 to 6. Notice when less M&Ms were given, how did you feel? And when you think of that, relate this back to how the brain gets used to the drug, and this is a decrease in dopamine. Now we're going to talk about different types of addiction. These three are 3 different types of addiction, but of course they don't represent all of the different types of addiction. There are many types, but they're not limited to food, drug, and alcohol. So alcohol addiction, alcohol has become a prevalent part of American society, present in many events and social situations. It is a depressant that slows down activity in the central nervous system. It can result in lessened feelings of anxiety, and because it is legal and so widely used, it can often be hard to recognize whether someone is addicted to alcohol or not. Generally, any usage of alcohol that results in negative consequences, such as strained relationships, problems at school, can be looked at as abuse. When abuse becomes frequent, it develops into addiction. Another type is food addiction. People can be addicted to highly palatable foods, including salty, fatty, and sugary foods. Occurs because the rewarding signals from these foods override the feeling of satisfaction and fullness. You can develop a tolerance to food where you need to eat more and more to experience the same level of satisfaction. And scientists believe that this is a contributing factor to obesity. And our last addiction that we will talk about, the last type, is drug addiction. Many people often assume that people who use drugs do not have a strong willpower or good morals. However, the issue is more complex. Taking drugs causes the brain to release rewarding neurotransmitters that make you feel good. Brain eventually adjusts by releasing less neurotransmitters, causing the abuser to use more drugs to try to achieve the same neurotransmitter amount. And the best way to not fall trap to this is prevention. So remember what we talked about with the M&M activity. The tolerance that is developed with the initial amount of the introduced drug. The second time that it's given, the tolerance has been built. So the effect is causing the abuser or the user to want to use more and more, and to introduce more and more of that neurotransmitter into the body, activating that neurotransmitter and causing the abuser to use more drugs to achieve the same neurotransmitter amount that was originally experienced. Now I'm going to allow my partner from Interaxon to go ahead and walk you through the rest of the presentation, and this includes the cycle itself.
Now that we've learned about the different types of addiction, let's discuss how this plays out in the cycle of addiction. The cycle begins with initial or early use, leading to abuse, tolerance, dependence, addiction, and lastly, relapse. The first stage is initial or early use. This includes the first time substance is used and the early experiences with the substance. This can begin as something totally harmless, like a prescription for a certain medication. It can also be prompted by peer pressure. Some risk factors, which are signs that may predispose someone to addiction, include family history of substance abuse, as well as family history of mental health disorders, abuse or neglect, a turbulent or chaotic living environment, having peers or family that are permissive about substance abuse, meaning that people in your life either use or give you permission to use. And last but not least, depression, social issues, and loneliness are key risk factors that can lead someone to addictive behaviors. After the early stages comes abuse. As defined by the World Health Organization, substance abuse is using a substance in a way that is harmful. Abuse is the point at which an individual is using the substance in a recurring, improper way. The nature of abuse depends on the addictive substance itself and how it acts on the body. So for illegal drugs, like heroin or methamphetamine, abuse occurs the first time a person uses the drug. But for something like legal tobacco or prescribed medication, abuse is harder to decipher or pinpoint exactly. In general, abuse is when the person starts using the substance for a high or euphoric release, rather than for the treatment or social aspect of the substance. Tolerance is the third stage of addiction, and it occurs when a person has been using a prescription drug or abusing substances over a long period of time. This is serious because substances actually cause changes in the brain. As a result of these physiological changes, the user builds tolerance, meaning that the original use of the substance no longer produces the same physical or mental effect. So, you would need more doses to achieve the same previous result. This can build and build, so tolerance to new dosages can lead to a cycle of heavy substance abuse. The fourth stage is dependence. This is an adaptive state that develops from repeated drug administration. The body or brain becomes dependent on having the substance to be able to function properly. Dependence results in withdrawal upon cessation of drug use, so when someone stops using the substance suddenly. Withdrawal is a group of symptoms that occur upon abrupt discontinuation or decrease in intake of medications or recreational drugs. Some of these symptoms include shakiness or trembling, insomnia, which means you can't sleep, nausea, and vomiting. After dependence, we've reached the fifth stage, addiction. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM-5, there are 11 signs and symptoms of substance abuse disorders like addiction. The severity of one's substance use disorder can be determined based on how many symptoms the user is experiencing. 2 to 3 symptoms indicates mild substance use disorder. 4 to 5 leads to the diagnosis of a moderate disorder. And 6 or more indicates that someone's suffering from severe substance disorder or addiction. Some of these 11 signs and symptoms include hazardous use, which means using in an unsafe manner, social or interpersonal problems related to use, neglected major roles to use, withdrawal, tolerance, used large amounts for longer amounts of time, repeated attempts to control, use, or quit, much time spent using, physical or psychological problems related to use, hobbies or activities given up to use, and also craving of the substance. Lastly, after addiction, one may try to quit. Stage 6 is when the user returns to the use of the substance or the behavior. This is called relapse. 40 to 60% of addicts relapse, per the National Institute on Drug Abuse. This is really high. For comparison, this is similar to the rate of adult onset diabetes, which is 30 to 50%, or asthma, which is 50 to 70%. There is hope, however, through the 5 steps of breaking the cycle. The first is pre-contemplation. The addict has not yet considered stopping the behavior or use of substances. The next is contemplation. The addict is starting to consider making a change in behavior. Next is preparation. The addict is mentally and possibly physically preparing to make a change. Next comes action. The addict has taken an action, such as seeking treatment, self-help groups, or counseling. Treatment has been provided and the addict has stopped using. Lastly is maintenance. The addict is maintaining his or her new lifestyle and behavior following a recovery program.
So let's now wrap up this presentation with a little bit of a review. We're going to ask you a set of questions. We'll give you some time to write down your answers, and hopefully at the end you'll be able to compare and see that you've got this presentation on addiction and the addiction cycle down. So our first question is, true or false, serotonin is the primary neurotransmitter responsible for the reward system in the brain? Let's see what the answer is. Give you a couple more minutes to write down. And it is false. The neurotransmitter that is actually responsible for the reward system in the brain is actually dopamine. Remember, we talked about the dopamine pathway and how we can label dopamine the feel-good neurotransmitter. Another question is, true or false? Shakiness is a symptom of drug dependence. And the answer is true. Other symptoms of withdrawal are insomnia, nausea, and vomiting. Remember, we compared the difference between drug abuse and drug dependence. And drug dependence was an adaptive state that develops from repeated drug administration, and it results in withdrawal upon stopping the drug use. So withdrawal, it occurs upon abrupt discontinuation or decrease in the intake of medications or recreational drugs, which basically means once the user has stopped, kind of the saying cold turkey, they completely stop taking the drugs, they exhibit symptoms of withdrawal. And of course, these include shakiness, trembling, insomnia, nausea, and vomiting. We just have a couple more questions for you.
Okay, let's now review the cycle of addiction. Which of the following is not one of the 11 signs and symptoms used to diagnose substance use disorders? A. Social or interpersonal growth related to use. B. Neglected major roles to use. C. Used larger amounts for longer amounts of time. D. Hobbies or activities given up to use. So we'll give you a few seconds to think. And the answer is B. One would not experience social or interpersonal growth related to drug use in a substance abuse disorder. One would experience problems arising as a result of their use. As a reminder, some of the other symptoms and signs can be withdrawal, hazardous use, tolerance, repeated attempts to control use or quit, much time spent using, physical or psychological problems related to use, and craving of the substance. Next, which of the following are risk factors that may lead to substance abuse disorder? A. A chaotic living environment. B. Depression, social issues, and loneliness. C. Family history of substance abuse. D. Abuse or neglect. Or E. All of the above. And we'll give you about 10 seconds to think about this one. And the answer is E. All of these are risk factors that may initiate the early use stage in the cycle of addiction. And this concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this video, you can learn more on our YouTube channel, UCLA Interaxon, or scan the QR code. You can also keep learning about neuroscience topics on our website, interaxon@ucla.org, or scan the QR code.